And the first kind of story conversation is going to need a little, we got to set the game pieces on the board.
Yeah, set the stage.
Before we can start kind of, playing the game. Like
there's a little bit of background here.
And the background of that is a recently released movie, not documentary. I don't know what kind of what do you call these sort of Borat-esque movies? There's got to be like a term for that. Maybe documentary, I guess. But by kind of cultural conservative pundit Matt Walsh, which is the movie "Am I a Racist?" Kind of his follow-up. He made waves for his. Was it What Is a Woman? His first, kind of documentary.
His big.
So he's kind of moving into sort of that sphere of creating films. It's a movie that I didn't see. I'm not crazy about Matt Walsh, as we'll get into, but I was interested. But I was on vacation when this came out.
Yeah,
I didn't go back.
I think it would have been a good one to review because I think I think these kinds of movies are interesting. And I think it's pushing back on a lot of sort of DEI stuff, which I'm all in favor of, and is doing it in sort of a clever way.
Yeah, and it's definitely this is a movie designed to be like a conversation starter. Yeah, and that has definitely happened. Although we haven't seen the movie, there are a lot of people out there that are having a conversation about this, and kind of the setting for the conversation we want to have is some people that had thoughts about this movie. So there's an episode 636 of the Holy Post podcast, which is like a kind of Christian podcast where kind of the main host that people might recognize, Phil Vischer, who is the creator of the VeggieTales. I believe he voices maybe like Bob the Tomato. I think he's one of the but the show that many of you, if you kind of grew up as a Christian kid in like the 90s, like
definitely
VeggieTales. You still got the bunny song stuck in your head all these years later. And for this episode, he was joined by host Mike Erie and also Sky Jethana, a former pastor and a current pastor, and they discussed this movie, the Am I Racist, from the perspective of Christians, and they had some. They took some issue with some like the tactics. Like again, if you're not familiar with the movie, this is like Matt Walsh undercover. He's in disguise and he's kind of tricking people into interviews that don't know that he's like actually like lampooning them. They think he's genuine and kind of this goes undercover and kind of tries to expose like who are they when their guard is down.
Right.
Very much like makes the proponents he's going against like this the butt of the jokes, and
at
least from what I can tell from the the trailers and some of the scenes that have released. And kind of one of the quotes that the podcast, the Holy Post podcast hosts kind of got into was where Matt Walsh had said, "The real dividing line is between those of us who are willing to do what it takes to win the culture war and those who are not." And the pastors, the hosts are on that podcast kind of unpacked it a bit, with one of them saying, kind of the big statement saying you cannot follow the Sermon on the Mount and engage in the culture war. One of the other co-hosts chimes in and says it's not just about lying and not just about the movie, obviously. This is an ethic that animates so much of the Christian subculture right now. If everything is on the line, then it justifies abandoning the way of Jesus in order to do what's necessary to save yourself and those you love. And then kind of the kicker at the end where they say, if you have to set aside the commands of Jesus in order to fulfill what you think is Jesus's agenda, then we can be sure that you are that is no longer Jesus that you're following. So pretty strong, words about this film, which didn't necessarily, if maybe the personality of Matt Walsh didn't,
he had feelings about that.
He had feelings, and he expressed those feelings in a video titled "VeggieTales Creators Has a Huge Problem with My Film." Here's a response. And we'll link the videos and the stuff into the show notes if you want to go watch like the full context. But just to pull a couple of sort of his main statements, and then we can kind of get into adjudicate this as a third wheel to the conversation.
Yeah.
Where so Matt Walsh says, "I'm not discussing their work," referring to the stuff by the Holy Post podcast host. "Nobody is. That's because they haven't done anything remotely worth discussing in their entire lives. They haven't done anything at all. Vischer did VeggieTales 30 years ago. That's something at least. These other guys, though, haven't done anything. ever to move or impact the culture in any way. They don't do anything. They don't create anything. Instead, they spend their time dismissively critiquing the only people actually doing and creating things. And then he accuses them, says, you are not even qualified to hold the positions that you currently hold. You should not be in a self-appointed position of Christian leadership or a supposed Christian thought leader or whatever if you actually don't know how to effectively spread the message of truth and fight back against evil in modern culture. And kind of the main thing of his response that I think we can get into in our podcast is where he takes issue with the quote about the Sermon on the Mount and says, kind of referring to what they said about, you can't follow the Sermon on the Mount and engage in the culture war, says there's a lot there, all of it bad. It's confused, morally and theological stew of nonsense. And it's coming from the sort of weak, ineffectual, uninspired, utterly useless, limp-wristed, spineless, little mealy-mouthed, empty vessels that have all but destroyed the Christian church in the West. If I had to sum up all the problems that the Western Christendom is having, I couldn't do it better than what that guy said. It perfectly summarized that ephemerate, castrated form of Christianity that has invaded the church like a parasite. It is a statement that misses the point so much that it is basically unintelligible. And then he kind of concludes by saying, well, let me clear this up. You can't follow the Sermon on the Mount unless you engage in a culture war. He quotes from scriptures, do not put a light, or do not light a candle and put it under a bush. Let your light shine before men. That is the culture war. And to unpack that a little bit further, he says, culture today is ruled by an ideology, referring to the DEI stuff, that aggressively militant against Christian values and Christian teachings. We want to stop that. We want to defeat that ideology and install Christian values in its place. The other option is to surrender. So you kind of have these two, one of them's on the North Pole, the other one's with the penguins in Antarctica. That's about as polarized of sort of opinions on what I think a lot of us have been, whether we're how deep onto the battlefield of the culture war we are. We've been around that conversation, that rhetoric. We've heard the words culture war. And here you sort of have the two, I think, sort of within Christendom, the two options, because even the Holy Post guys say that they agree with Walsh in one thing, and that is the dividing line. Those that will just sort of do whatever it takes to win the culture war, or for their view, those that will adhere more to the commands of Jesus rather than the culture war. So, what are some of your initial thoughts on this? I think we both have
a lot of thoughts. I think
a lot of thoughts, but you've eavesdropped, you've watched in on this conversation.
So I did watch the Matt Walsh's video sort of response, and he shows the clips of Phil and the other guys talking about this, and I think one thing that's clear is I just think they're coming at this from two very different places, and both claiming to come from the same place in a weird way. It's like they think they're both on the same team, but I don't know that they are, and if that makes sense. So what Phil and the guys are talking about is really coming at the culture war idea from a Christian perspective. So what would Christ do in the midst of this? How would he approach this? And for Matt, it seems like it's not so much about Christ and sort of the truth of Christ. It's really about sort of the values that are espoused by the Bible and Christianity. And so in this weird way, they're almost both right, because if what Matt Walsh is saying is we're about trying to install Christian values rather than the opposite of Christian values, well, then the way to do that is perhaps what he is doing, which is fighting this culture war and the sort of dogma versus dogma. But if what you're trying to do is spread the gospel of Christ, that's actually the opposite of what you should be doing. And so it's interesting to see, I think Matt Walsh kind of just misses the entire point of their critique about
the video. In many ways, his response sort of reflects or validates or whatever the critiques of him. He sort of embraces what they say and leans into it. Yeah, exactly. That's why. I mean, in a way, they kind of do the same thing. And I think to be clear, I don't necessarily, again, I haven't seen Matt Walsh's movie, but I don't from what I've seen of it, don't necessarily have as strong of an issue as the Holy Post guys do, as far as like that tactic and like, or I think there is value in having those conversations and pushing back against ideologies. Like
like I would say it's probably a fun movie and it's probably funny. If who knows, but I think it's worth having movies like that.
Yeah, and I think it probably is effective for even like I've seen this on in the YouTube space, right? Different like kind of non-Christian reviewers that like have actually talked about. Like, I think it's done good. So like my issue isn't that like I don't think this movie should be made or that I'm like. It's the thing about this statement that when I saw it, I was like, okay, there's something it doesn't jive with me, is more just the conflation of like that, not that this thing that we're doing is bad. It's just that this thing that we're doing is not this. Like, it's not the Christian, this isn't the Christian mission. Like maybe it's an area where as Christians we can be involved in sort of the culture, but I think it sort of embodies a Christian worldview that I just find, prevalent, but like just disaster, like a very dangerous mindset that where it does sort of in a circular way, it just sort of make everything all about culture. Like I think like kind of sort of this cultural Christianity that you keep hearing and, guys like Elon Musk are espousing it. Like, it's like when you see everything through the lens of just sort of this culture war, then like it all becomes about the culture. Like that's what you're fighting over. We can be sort of a cultural, Christianity, like it can lead, I think, very easily to a Christianity without Christ. Like,
which I think is what you see. Like, I think when you see these sort of conversations, it is very much like there's really no mention of Christ, I think, in like Walsh's response.
Yeah, and in some ways, he actually, the scripture he quotes that sort of does mention Christ, or at least represent Christ, like he reinterprets that, like because he talks about the quote, his like proof text for the culture wars, don't light a candle and like hide it under a bush, and he's like, shining that light is the culture war. Like that's sort of these values that we need to instill, which just isn't what the scripture's saying. Like, is the light, when Jesus talks about, spread the light, is that light mean like these sort of Christian values about gender roles and stuff? Or like, is the light Jesus?
Yeah.
Like, spread me, like, have me in you, radiate that in the culture. Like, let me set you free rather than just sort of this, like, the values and sort of Jesus's like agenda, what Jesus wanted to accomplish, which even like, because even that though, like, misses the mark. Like sort of this idea that like, we need to this is what Jesus called us to do, is to fight the culture war, because you just can't find that with Jesus. Like in many ways, like the reason he was killed by sort of the Jewish authority and leaders is because he wouldn't fight the culture war. Like they wanted this their Messiah to come and like, hey, let's kick the butts of these Romans and let's set up this powerful kingdom, and like we will be sort of this religious nation and community. And like Jesus is like, well, I'm actually gonna go have like lunch and dinner with some sinners and like go find some women at a well and talk to them and like wash some feet of some people. And they're like, yeah, we'll pass on that. Like, that's not, we want you to fight our battles. And
it's
like,
you need to be taking up a sword.
Like, I want to go love people, because even and then you can chime in again, but like, I even take issue with like sort of him being dismissive of these pastors. Like, they have not done anything at all. Like very hyperbolic language, to move the culture. And it's just like, well, like these guys are pastors. Like, I don't know them. It's not like, I'm assuming they're good, upstanding Christian pastor men. But like I'm assuming they've led people to Christ and baptized people, like things that I don't think Matt Walsh is baptizing people. Like sort of this idea that like, but in sort of that cultural Christianity worldview, like that's not what matters. Like, it's not about leading people, setting them free from their sin, leading them to Christ, baptizing them, getting them plugged into a church. It's about just the values, the sort of the stuff around Christ without Christ. Yeah. Which I think was why he can dismiss them as like, they obviously haven't done anything for sort of God's kingdom, because all they've done is give people Jesus. Like, but they haven't really made these widespread cultural things to push back against sort of unbiblical, ideologies and stuff. Like, am I crazy for that, or is that?
No, I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head with that. I mean, it very much is, watching his response to sort of their critique. I think it is just very validating of their critique, and it's just to me, it's odd that someone would just kind of go on the offensive and name call these people for sort of being critical of the stuff he put out, and it's just kind of this weird time, I think, that we're living in where, like, he could make this whole video and not really address the issue or completely miss the issue. But I think from his perspective, maybe he really put them in their place. And yet, like you said, like to say that like they've not done anything, I don't know. There's just some really bold statements from Mr. Walsh.
Yeah, and there's a level of arrogance too. Like,
yeah,
like almost this assumption, like whether they would embrace this at all, like, but implicit at least that we can like more effectively accomplish Jesus' agenda than Jesus could. Like,
yeah,
if the goal is just to spread these Christian values in the in the culture, well, Jesus didn't really do that. Like, Jesus wasn't interested in doing that. Like, Jesus didn't act in a way, like, I think Jesus' character was one of loving of sinners and grace and patience. Like, he wasn't just angry, ranting about that. Like, sort of the things that you see in a lot of like the cultural Christianity.
yeah.
I feel like especially by framing it so starkly of like, like you guys are just, you guys are basically the enemy. You're working. This is how Walsh ends the video. Like,
Right.
You're working against. Like, by framing it so starkly, it's almost like Jesus's character would be framed as the enemy in that context. Like,
Right.
It's like, well, like, Jesus, he had some good principles, but he just wasn't willing to like fight the battle hard enough.
Yeah.
He is this sort of this, soft, he was going to go die and not even like, fight back against these, Roman secular, pagan ideologies. And,
Yeah.
but we in 2024, like, we can be mean enough and like, we can sort of be manly enough to like actually step out and start fighting for these battles, fighting for Jesus, fight when Jesus can, stand behind me, I got my shield, we're going to go fight. And like, there's this like a disgusting arrogance to that of like,
Yeah.
like if you like that Jesus didn't know how to accomplish his kingdom, and we do because we're willing to like say mean things and fight back. And like, I don't know, like that's, if you just look at like hold that connect those characters up, like I think like, what one is more representative of how Christ did it. I mean, that's pretty clear.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. And I just think and I think that's what's so, I think can be so destructive about this ideology and this conflation of sort of Christianity with some sort of maybe just Christian values. Like the ethics and the values of Christianity, I think, is not a replacement for Christianity. And yet, I think there are many people, maybe Matt Walsh included, who would say that it seems like, no, it is a replacement. And what we really need is the Christian values in our society. And what they see is the problem, the DEI stuff or woke, whatever. All these things, we can agree that we don't like those things, but is the response and is the solution to those things like, well, we're just going to like get more Christian values pumped into the system, by whatever means necessary. That's not going to solve the problem either. And because I think you could look back and see, like, we had a bunch of Christian values, you could say, for many years, and where has that led us? And, it's like, well, we're in this place of like all the woke nonsense or whatever. And so I don't know. I think he really just misses the whole point of, I think, what Phil and the other guys were saying.
Yeah, and I think there's also just like a selfish component too of like, I feel like the hope of like winning the culture war. I think if you boil it down in a simplistic sense, maybe, but like it's really about us. Like we want to live in a country, in a nation that has these values that we, I guess,
Yeah.
it's sort of like, the world, we don't like, raising my kids in a, we're both parents, like raising our kids in a world that is, has these ideologies. And like, I get that. Like, I don't want there's things I need to help my kids navigate. And I will be glad when some of these ideologies sort of do, get put in their place. But it's sort of all about us. I guess there's very little in sort of the culture war rhetoric of like, setting people free from their sin, or like helping other, it's sort of like, well, if we can just sort of, break their grasp on this sort of, political ideology or something like that.
If we can de-chair them from these, academic halls.
It's like that's gonna in some ambiguous way, like, set them free. And as though like tearing that down is the same thing as like giving them Jesus and not just leaving them empty. Like, which is why I think which is why I wanted to talk about this conversation. Because to me, I mean, even like here with our collision, like we try and take, like, that's why we don't sort of take a lot of like the culture war stuff. Like, not that we don't, like, I have my opinions on a lot of the culture war stuff. Like, not that Christians should be engaged in some of that. Like, there should be, and there's things that Christians should push back. Like, the pro-life, all that kind of, there's things for Christians to very much, racist things, and there's things Christians should stand up and take action for.
Yeah.
It's just that I feel like we lose the plot when it becomes just about sort of, what Jesus sort of wanted rather than Jesus. Like, I don't think Jesus is interested in us being like, well, here's sort of some life lessons and some governing principles for a country. Like, here, you take that, and then you go off, and I'll sort of be over here in heaven doing, like, he wants us to have him. And I feel like some of the rhetoric of this just misses that completely.
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, I think that's the thing, because you can't really look at the scripture and draw those conclusions that we need to be out there like battling for culture, like, because I think it misses the whole point of the gospel, the whole point of Jesus, because it's the exact opposite of the approach that Jesus would take.
Well, it's funny, and then we can maybe end on this, but because it is the exact opposite. Like the harshest words, the closest Jesus ever came to like delivering like a Matt Walsh-esque speech was like towards the religious people that were so obsessed with like the principles and the rules and the command. Like, so it was sort of the culture of religion, and yet missed him. Like, there wasn't room in their sort of religious, belief for like to actually relate to him. Like, that's like the most we ever see Jesus sort of, like start spitting fire a bit was against sort of that cultural, like not Christianity at the time, like that cultural religion. If we can just sort of keep this, if we can just sort of police our country, our nation, to like just live by these codes,
right?
Then that's what matters, and that's what's gonna, that's what will make us pleasing to God. And like Jesus is like, no, like I have no place for that. I'm the only answer to that. Like, it doesn't. You can keep all those commands, and this nation can be, as like traditionally like proper Jewish as possible, and yet still completely miss out like on the kingdom that I'm.
Well, and I think it so clearly summarizes it when, like Jesus said, I am the truth, not I will direct you to the truth. And I think that maybe sort of perfectly summarizes some of, I think, the issues that we're seeing now sort of in this cultural Christianity, Christian values versus Christianity or following Jesus. And it's when Jesus says, I am the truth, it's like the whole point of it is a relationship with Christ, not like, hey, I have the best path to these enlightened values over here. Like, the values are a byproduct, I think, of following Christ. And I think when you just take the byproduct and sort of skip over the point, then this is what you're left with is this just weird culture war of like,
and it's just empty.
Yeah,
because it's a war without substance, because you've removed the thing that gives those principles and stuff substance. But I think it is so attractive because it doesn't demand anything. It's
all, and you said, it's all about you. And I think that's what it's like. Oh yeah, well, just give me my marching orders and I'll go. And
it puts you in the position of the one in power. Like,
right.
I know how this culture should run. I have the truth.
Yeah.
So I'm going to go march and be mean and push back and fight this war and put down the ungodly enemies. Like, that applies more to like our carnal, sinful nature than like, I'm going to go submit as a sinner before God, and like, I'm going to surrender my, my own sort of agency and all that stuff, and purely, just surrender to God. That's a way more demanding, and like that goes against our sinful nature, which is why I think this sort of brand of Christianity, this sort of like culture war, cultural Christianity, I think why it spreads so much is like because it really gives you the good stuff that we want without any of the sacrifice. Like
Yeah.
this isn't a pick up your cross Christianity. It's like pick up your sword and go fight. And
Right.
woo, we're going to win the culture war, and it's going to be about us, and we're going to be in charge. And as opposed to actually, I'm going to lay it all down at Jesus' feet, and I'm not in control. I got to just trust God on this, and if God calls me to speak or to act, I will. But starting from that position of surrender and humility. And I think that's what is completely missing in a lot of this conversation. But hey, if you guys have strong thoughts on that, or just if you've seen sort of that mindset, I mean, it's hard not to find that sort of culture of Christianity. But I think that is, I think there is a dividing line there, and it is one that I do think the podcast host, you almost need to pick a side. You need to decide, am I just fighting a culture war, or am I submitting to Jesus? Because I think you can't really have either of those as the priority at the same time. But